in an analog form using cables, or in the form of optical, once people started developing, actually here, for example, in say New York, the concept of fiber optical communication, long distance optical fibers, and super importantly, the big investments that all the governments across the world made to form an optical fiber backbone that connects every little town everywhere in the world, and then allows them to have all these conversations globally, right? And then, of course, the last thing, and I just want to mention it, starting in the late 80s and early 90s, the concept of the internet was developed, right? Actually, there is a key concept in the word internet. Inter actually means interoperability, which means that any device that is connected to the network is able to talk to other devices, even though they come from different providers, right? So your Macintosh computer can talk to your Windows computer, right? And maybe people don't like doing that, but you can do it, right, in principle. And this is because you are able to disconnect the performance from the hardware all the way to the software level, right? So as long as the hardware can talk to each other, the hardware can be agnostic and have different platforms, right? This is what is called the internet stack, right? Very important. For some of you that have studied this or have seen it in some presentations, this is the concept of the TCP/IP protocol that allows you to communicate by knowing the IP addresses of computers between different places, right? I'm telling you all this because then that will come very handy later. All right. So then, of course, having all this beautiful infrastructure, right? We are quantum optics people, so we always ask the question, what happens if instead of sending millions of photons per pulse, in which you are amplitude and frequency modulating, you actually go into the quantum limit, and then you only have one photon or perhaps two photons every pulse that is being distributed, right? So there is a few things that you gain, of course. One of them is the fact that now, because we know and love photons because they are quantum particles, we can actually put them into superpositions, right? And then what we want to do is to move those photons in these fibers in a way that then maintain the quantum coherence, right? So this superposition of eigenstates that are moving in the fiber, right? And then once they travel in this fiber, and then we find the means to preserve this quantum coherence, then we want to devise systems that are waiting for those photons at the end, in which then we can exchange the information that those photons are carrying in a way that then it can remain static, right? And then this is where beautiful concepts such as quantum memories, light matter interfaces, etc., start coming into play. All right. So now, for this talk in particular, right, we are very interested in building something that is different than the internet that we want to build on top of it, right? So then the concept of quantum entanglement becomes very important here, because the task of these quantum communication systems is going to be to distribute entangled states over longer and longer distances, right? So here to describe entanglement, I'm going to use a little bit of an experimental approach, right? So then normally the way we do this in the laboratory, and then you have there a picture of the experiment, right? You see here we have two nonlinear crystals. You see here crystal 1 and crystal 2. And because this process that is called spontaneous parametric down conversion, that I think, as I learned today, some of you actually do in your senior and grad laboratory, you can actually produce pairs of photons, right? On the basis of one high energy blue photon here, you can produce pairs here, right? And if you actually do this correctly, and then you use identical crystals that are rotated by 90 degrees, you can actually produce pairs of photons that have different polarizations, right? So for example, two of the photons can be horizontally polarized, or if they are producing the second crystal, they can be then vertically polarized, right? And the trick is, if you use linearly polarized light here, which we know can be described as a superposition of horizontal and vertical light, then we can, with 50% probability, produce two horizontally polarized photons or two vertically polarized photons, which is described as this very famous state, the so-called Bell state, right? And so this is very important, right? And everything is encompassed in this phrase. If you were to have those two photons communicated over a very, very long distance, if you were to perform an operation in one, you will immediately know the state of the other one, right? I mean, so then, there are some communications that need to happen in between, so then you don't violate any physical principle. But say you could gain a means to transfer information from one place to the other one that is completely different from what we do these days. Okay, so this is what is so interesting, and is becoming a very important thing to grab these states, produce them with specific properties, transport them using the optical fiber that we already have, and then see what kind of new things we can do with them that already act on the capabilities of the current internet. So here's a very important realization as to what people are thinking. So very briefly describing here we're describing a concept that is called quantum teleportation, right? This is what these communication systems are very important, right? Because if you are able to distribute this entanglement, right, you can perform this operation of quantum teleportation to move information from one place to the other one, right? And then here I describe this really quickly. What you need is basically it's a 3-photon process, right? You need to have one of these entangled pairs, right? And then what you need to have is a third photon that now is prepared in a quantum superposition. Right? I have a video, hopefully the video runs so then you can see how this is done. And then the idea is to, by making a measurement of this photon that is carrying a qubit with one of the photons from the entangled pair, if you do the appropriate measurement, you can then communicate a preparation state that you can apply to the other photon that can be, for example, traveling in the fiber. And if you do the right measurement, the qubit that you had at the beginning now is going to be then teleported into the other one, right? Some form of like a Star Trek fashion, right? Now, it's important to say that this is a very different kind of communication, right? Because normally in communication that we do, the information moves in the fiber, right? In this kind of communication, the entanglement moves in the fiber, and the communication and the information are communicated to this, quantum entanglement highway. So it's a very different way to do it. That, of course, it happens to be more secure because now everything is protected with quantum mechanics. All right? Okay, so here's a video, hopefully it runs, of how these teleportation experiments work. So you see there, this is a pulse of a laser that is meant to prepare these Bell states that we were describing before. All right, so I'll just follow this video. So then you see this laser pulse is going there, and then it's going to hit this nonlinear crystal that we have in the slide. Notice that here we're going to produce 2 pairs of entangled photons. That will become clear in a minute. See that you produce an entangled state, and you can see it because it's green, and then you have this spooky interaction at a distance. There is a second one that is used to generate that qubit that we want to teleport. This is done by sending one of the photons to a detector, and in doing that, we can guarantee that there's only one photon that is prepared in that qubit by that polarizer. Now you see you have the qubit, and then one of the photons from the entangled state is coming here. Then you perform this so-called measurement here, right? That then allows you to then measure a state here, and if you know what you measured here and you communicate it, then this photon that was basically moving in this long-distance network, if you prepare it in the right state here, this will be exactly the qubit that you prepared at the beginning, right? And of course, if you can achieve that big goal of moving this entanglement over a very long distance, then the idea is that then you can teleport all these qubits at very high rates between different places, right? So then, let's say some people are discussing, of course, this is a little bit more in the realm of something that we could do, right? So say, for example, something that the internet cannot do these days is to move large amounts of data, and what I mean like this, like terabytes of data, from one place to the other one rapidly, right? There is no service that can do that. So say, for example, the scientists in CERN, when they need to move data from CERN to one of the institutions in North America that analyze the data, they still have these scientists that actually carry these hard drives in planes because it's terabytes and terabytes of data because you cannot transport this online. So people imagine that if you were to have this quantum entanglement highway, you can, in principle, teleport large amounts of data almost instantaneously, right? This is one of the dreams, definitely not to be done these days, but maybe in the future. Okay, so then it's cool, we can do teleportation, and this is something really nice because it opens a new way of communicating things that is secure, protected by quantum mechanics, and perhaps it can also be done with like really, really large amounts of data. Okay? So because of this, this is a very important objective of this quantum communications community, right? There's lots of teams across the world that are trying to do experiments and demonstrate that teleportation and entanglement distribution can be performed using the fiber infrastructure. All right, so I mentioned here 3 experiments from a few years ago that were very popular, right? Here is an experiment in Hefei, right? Hefei is a city in China that is about an hour and a half from the main city of Shanghai. And here they have this experiment, Professor Yang Wei-Pan did an experiment where they have this entanglement source, and they were able to put one photon in a fiber about 15 kilometers long, and the other photon in another fiber about 15 kilometers long. And then by doing correlated measurements, they demonstrated that the entanglement was preserved. Right? For many years, this was actually the record on moving entanglement, right? There's another experiment that was performed there in Calgary, where I did my grad school, that is connecting the campus of the University of Calgary here with the campus of the Southern Alberta Technology Institute. And then you see it's a similar experiment that demonstrated something like 13 or 14 kilometers of propagation and demonstration of entanglement. Maybe some of you have read about this Chinese satellite, the Misu satellite that is now in space, and they have an entangled source like the one that I showed you in one of the slides. And now they're able to actually shine these photons, and by having systems with large telescopes, they can actually get some of those photons and be able to demonstrate the transfer of entanglement over hundreds of kilometers, 500 kilometers, 600 of kilometers, right? And then, so this is basically something that is now possible, right? So then, one of the questions that we're always asking, right, is if you have that, how is that you can then make this a service, right? And then the way to think about it is, well, you know, if you open your Zoom account, right? Normally you have the computer of your friend that could be Europe or Asia, whatever your friend is, and they're your computer, right? And then what you do, right, is through this internet stack, you request a service. You say, I want to talk to this computer in this IP address, and I want to share video and data, right? So you will eventually like to do something similar in which you have 2 parties and they say, I want to have entangled photons so then I can teleport you my Instagram pictures. Some form of a quantum fancy Instagram or something, right? So then that's the question, right, that people are asking these days. How is it then you can develop a system akin to the internet that we have, but in which the task is now to distribute entangled pairs across any IP address, right? And remember, you can really do this classically for any IP address anywhere you want. So eventually, it will be fantastic that we could distribute entanglement over any IP address that we want. Will that be fantastic? Okay. So then, this is actually very interesting. This slide shows you the evolution of this concept of what the quantum internet is. Right. A few years ago, and I was just having this conversation today. Professor Jeff Kimball from Caltech had this wonderful paper, right? This reference here from 2008, where he defined the quantum internet as a collection of entangled sources where you're distributing entanglement and quantum-like matter interfaces where then you can map this entanglement into some form of superposition of atoms that then you can say wait and then use later, right? And then now these days, 15 years later, we're thinking about a different definition of a quantum internet, which is more relevant to the actual definition of the internet, in which now you have quantum routers that allow you then to define the location of different places where you want to then move the entanglement to, right? And in order to do that over long distances, there's new pieces of quantum hardware that we need to develop. One of them is called the quantum repeater. We'll discuss much in a little bit. This, in the quantum computing community, building a quantum computer that has 1,000 qubits or maybe tens of thousands of qubits is a holy grail. For us in the quantum communication community, building a quantum repeater right now is a holy grail, because if you can do that, then you can then transfer entanglement over long distances and then make this service closer and closer to reality, right? And then don't forget, something that is very important is, as the internet works in this stack version, that then allows you to separate the algorithms from the hardware, you need to start building these concepts, developing these concepts. How is an in-stack approach is going to look for entanglement distribution services, right? Those are really interesting questions. that somehow show the multidisciplinarity of this quantum internet business. All right. So then one of the tools that we want to use, and this is actually a very wonderful result. Imagine that you have two entangled sources, right? So two Bell states, right? So channel 1 and channel 2 are entangled, for example, in a polarization basis. And then you have another pair of photons that are entangled, channel 3 and channel 4, right? And then what you do is, for example, here in this experiment, channel 3 and channel 2 are going to be put into fibers that then go a long distance, right? They're going to be moving in that fiber. And then somewhere in between, you're going to take channel 4 and channel 1. Right? So remember, channel 1 and channel 4, they are not entangled to each other. And then you send them into this measurement station where they actually go here into a beam splitter. And then you have some polarization characterization here. So this is what is called a Bell state measurement, because what you want to do is to, on the basis of these measurements here, you want to project these two states that originally were not entangled into an entangled state here that then you eliminate by detecting. All right? By doing this projection, what the end effect of this is to actually build an entangled state in the photons that are propagating in the fiber, and now they are a very far distance apart. Right? This is actually a very nice result and is basically constructed on the basis that these Bell states are actually an orthonormal basis of 4 photon states. So you can always write a 4 photon state, any 4 photon state, into a superposition of Bell states. So if you project into a Bell state, the net outcome is that then the other 2 photons that remain are now entangled. All right? This has a very beautiful name. It's called entanglement swapping. Right? So then entanglement swapping is a tool that we have to, by basically putting more entanglement into our network, we can achieve longer and longer distances for the propagation of entanglement. Say, for example, this cartoon shows you more or less how this is done, right? So imagine that you want to have entanglement, for example, between IPA and IPC here, right? So if the distance is just too large, your photons will never going to arrive there, right? Because of the losses, right? But then what you start doing is you start decomposing the problem into smaller segments. So for example, here, now you have one source here that goes from A to D, one source here that goes from WC. And then what you can do is then make even smaller segments. For example, A and B are entangled, C and D are entangled, W and X, Y and Z. Those are entangled sources. And then what you do, then you do entanglement swapping between B and C, entangling therefore A and D, twice the distance, and so forth, right? For example, here swapping between X and Y, entanglement these two, and then you can make another swapping between D and W, therefore entangling these ones, right? So then in principle, if you have sources that are good enough and have enough rates of entanglement distribution, you can perform as many of these entanglement swap operations as you can, right? So say, again, in principle, okay? What you see here, of course, is that in this little cartoonish representation, right, the assumption is that all the entangled sources are equidistant, which of course might not necessarily be the case if you want to use the current fiber infrastructure. Collocation facilities exist where collocation facilities exist, and certainly they are not equidistant, right? So then what you need, right, you can already see it here, you need a means to buffer, right? This is a concept that comes from optical networking. Photons that are arriving here at B and that are arriving here at C, if these optical paths are different, you need a means to buffer the photons, so then you can wait for the photons to be simultaneously present and then perform that swapping operation. Okay, so this buffering is the key to many of the things that we do these days. Okay, so then in this video here, we're describing how these buffers work, right? They have a very important name. They are called quantum memories, right? So these quantum memories are capable of taking these entangled photons, and then you transfer the quantum information, in this case, the entanglement, into some form of atomic superposition that is long-lived, that then you can then wait until the other photon arrives, and then you can do the Bell state measurement, right? So let's run the video and so you can see how this is helping us then to scale things. So here you see in the video, right? You produce the 2 photons, right? Tangled pair. You store them into these quantum memory devices. We'll talk more about that in a few slides. You have another source, more quantum memories, right? After you perform your Bell state measurements, and now you have these two memories entangled. So then you can now perform this with another link that is further distance apart, right? Now you see it's coming in the video, right? So you can keep doing this, and then by always entangle these memories and doing the swapping procedures, the net effect is like now the entanglement, first of all, is in memories. So then now you have it on demand. And second of all, occur a longer distance, right? So in this case, the quantum memories are like your computers, right? If you think about it, they can have an IP address. And as long as you know the IP address of your quantum memory, that's how then you can achieve teleportation services that are on demand, right? So this is a very beautiful, beautiful concept. And so this is, to some extent, one of my students made this very beautiful figure that shows the research that has to go into developing this dream of having entanglement services on demand, right? There's three important things that are here. We'll talk about two of them in the remainder of the talk, but you already see here. First of all, you need to develop entangled sources, right? But remember, these entangled sources, they need to fulfill two things that are very important. On the one hand side, they need to be as fast as you can, meaning that they produce as many entangled pairs as you can over a second. For example, when people talk about 5G, that is 5 gigahertz speed in bit distribution. So what you want is to have gigahertz speed in what people these days are calling E-bits, entanglement bit distribution, right? So 5G entangled networks, that would be awesome one day, right? And the other thing is like these sources, if you really want to manipulate them and use it with these quantum memories, they need to be compatible with the technology that you're using to build these quantum memories. For example, in our case, we use atomic quantum memories. Therefore, these entangled sources need to be compatible with atomic experiments. So we'll discuss this in a second floor, okay? And then once you have that, then you need to develop quantum memory systems, right? You see them here, that allow you to store, right, these entangled photons, preserving the entanglement. So then say, for example, here in the middle, you can perform a Bell state measurement, therefore entangling this long distance memory to that long distance memory, right? Which will be the goal describing this video. All right. So up to here, any questions? That is the half of the introduction that we wanted to do. Here, remember, yes, please.
So with the entanglement swapping, we go from a multi-photon state and we kind of progress down to just two entangled photons, correct?
I guess you always have bipartite entanglement, right? It's always in pairs. But then, you start with 2 and 2, and then by doing a Bell state measurement, you eliminate these two because you detect them,
right? And
you ended up with only 2. So entanglement is always bipartite.
Now, is there an associated drop in efficiency by going from this multi-photon generated states and, progressively as you do iterations, you
correct. You always lose in speed.
Yeah.
Right? Because all these systems are not 100% efficient.
Right.
So then if you start with a source that has gigahertz, after several hundreds of kilometers, maybe you end with a system that is entanglement is distributed over 200 kilometers with a rate of maybe megahertz instead of gigahertz. Mm-hmm. So you always pay in speed.
Do you have a way of compensating for that?
Yes, that's what it's called multiplexing, right? So instead of just building one repeater, now you can build repeaters with a slightly different frequency. And just how we do in classical networks, you can have many wavelengths operating at the same time in the same fiber. So then you gain for that. That's how you can actually get to 5G in classical networks. Right? Good questions. All right. So then here's a historical note, right? I guess in the 1980s, here in this very university, right? 2 grad students and Hong and Oh, and one professor, right, Mandel, they had this wonderful experiment that allowed them to measure interference of single photons, right? And to measure a new class of, let's say, quantum property that is called indistinguishability, right? So that is if you haven't read that paper, please go ahead and read it because it's the classic and it was measured here, right? And so what we want to do, right, is in order to make experiments that are memory assisted, so we can do entanglement swapping, we have to demonstrate that after the memories store the entanglement, when it comes out, the properties were not modified And then we have to make these interference experiments with high fidelity to demonstrate that these Bell state measurements are possible, right? So then this Hongo-Mendel, with the exit of these quantum memories, it is a prime requisite to do anything in quantum networking. And then so I put this in here as a historical note, of course, but also because it's a tool that we use all the time to demonstrate that you can do quantum network operations with quantum memory. All right. So then, how much time do I have left? Just so I know.
Half an hour.
Half an hour. We're good. Great. So then, what I want to show you now is the two test beds that we're building on Long Island that are trying to address this big question that we put in there, right? So on the one hand, we want to demonstrate, and this is something that we've been building in my lab in Stony Brook already for like 8 years. We want to demonstrate a tabletop demonstration of a quantum repeater in which you can use memories to do entanglement swapping. All right. So then normally these experiments are measured in PhD lifetimes. Normally these experiments have like 2 or 3 PhD student lifetime. That's the amount that it takes to make them, right? And then I'm going to show you the other testbed that now we're building, connecting my Stony Brook laboratory to a new laboratory that we built in the last 3 years in Brookhaven, where we are now exploring how to bring all these concepts of entanglement distribution, quantum memory operation to the telecom in current fiber infrastructure, commercial fiber infrastructure. Okay, so then here is another tiny video that shows what is what we want to do with these quantum memories, right? These quantum light matter interfaces in which we want to map the information that those photons are carrying into some form of a long-lived atomic excitation, right? So then normally in atomic physics, you know, here in the video, we have some cell, right, where we have some atoms, right? And then what you do is by shining lasers that are resonant with them, you can prepare these atoms in certain transitions such that then the photons that are coming are then resonant to that transition, and then there can be an interaction through the electrical dipole between the photons and the atoms, all right? So then we run the video, and then we talk a little bit about the theory of how this works. All right, so then the photons come in there, then as they are propagating in the medium, you want to get rid of these lasers, and in this process, you want to map the probability distribution of that photon into the probability distribution of the atoms, and then by switching the lasers on back again, that distribution can be actually mapped out. Right? This is just the toy of that. And then here we're actually saying what it actually happened. All right? So then here we have to use basically two tools, okay? So then remember, in here we have atoms, right? And then we're going to have two fields. On the one hand, we're going to have that photon that is carrying the quantum information. And on the other hand, we're going to have laser light that is allowing us to optically modify the refractive index of the medium, right? The frequencies of these two fields need to be carefully crafted such that one is resonant with one atomic transition and the other one is resonant to the other atomic transition by sharing one excited state. This is what is called a lambda configuration, right? Obviously, so it's a lambda configuration, okay? So then what you gain by doing this is what you want to do. If you remember your quantum optics classes, or maybe you will take your quantum optics classes soon, the way we actually describe photon fields, right, is basically by describing one quanta of energy that is existing in different frequency modes. You don't know which frequency mode it exists in. It can exist in all of them at the same time, right? It's in a quantum superposition. And therefore, it also happens in time, right? That photon can appear at any given moment in time here with different probabilities following this photon temporal envelope that is normally assigned when you create it, right? So if you have this, right, now that you can, what you can do is because you have this control laser that is addressing this transition, right? Depending in which area where your atoms are here, so say for example here, you have more, let's say, electric field strength of the photon. So in this create a particular quantum superposition between these two ground states of the atoms. But then as you move in the temporal envelope of the photon, remember this is moving, right? Then here you have less strength. So then the atomic superposition will be a little bit tinier. And then here at the wings, then the superposition is almost non-existent, right? It's very, very, very small. But then by doing this, you are mapping the temporal envelope of the photon into a coherent superposition of atoms in which each atom has been excited differently, corresponding to the strength of the photon at that particular position, right? This is a very important. We're mapping the photon temporal envelope into a geometrical distribution of the excitations of all these atoms that are being seen by the photon, right? And then there is some math that you can work out to make this problem time dependent. And the beauty of this is that if exactly when the photon is right there in the atomic excitation, you switch off the control field, right? The property that that photon was carrying now will be stored as what is called a spin wave, a superpositions of electrons in that particular collective state. All right. So this is very nice. This is how we can actually map the temporal envelope of the photons into an atomic superposition of things, right? And then now what you have to do, right? You have to do this not for one photon, but you want to do it for two photons because now they are carrying entanglement, right? So then you want to send one photon into one memory here and another photon into the other memory here. And then to the point that you were asking me, right? If you have efficiencies when you're writing it, when you're reading it, when you are cleaning all the systems, these are all the efficiencies that then decrease the rate of entanglement distribution after you put that into the quantum memories, okay? So then the goal is to actually be able to store two states, entangled states in here and in here, right? And hopefully have these memories as far apart as you can, connected by power. All right? So here is the last piece of information, right? Remember, I told you how to store the temporal envelope of the photon. However, that doesn't tell us still to store the polarization state of the photon. That was just step number one, right? So then this was the thesis of one of my students, Mary, that graduated like 3 years ago. So then what we developed here was this concept of qubit quantum memories, right? Memories that are able to store a photonic state, which is a superposition of polarizations, such as the one that then create quantum entanglement, okay? So then here, what you want to do is, instead of having just one light matter interface, like the one that I described before, now you want to have two light matter interfaces. Notice that I put it here, right? Photon comes in here, but now instead of only going to one, now it's going to two, right? So if here I have a polarization qubit, I can use, for example, a birefringent material like calcite, and then I can separate, right? 50% of the times the photon will have horizontally polarized light will go here, vertically polarized will go here, right? And then what I can do is I can drive simultaneously two of these lambda systems in the atoms, right? So one lambda system will store the horizontal part of the photon, right? Remember, you don't know if you make 1,000 experiments, 500 times it will be horizontally polarized, the other 500 times it will be vertically polarized, but you don't know in a shot-by-shot basis, so you have to be able to store both at the same time, right? So then by doing that, now you store half of the photon here, half of the photon there, and as long as this interferometer is nicely balanced, when you retrieve the photon out of the memory, it will actually retrieve the qubit state, right? In the last year, there have been many experiments doing these things. England, Switzerland, Israel, Canada, here in the US. Now we have demonstrated that you can do these processes with fidelities up to like 99%, which means that the polarization state can be stored and retrieved while still storing them over, let's say, almost a millisecond storage time. You multiply that by the speed of light, you already have like almost hundreds of kilometers buffering possibilities, right? Then there's been a lot of progress on that recently. Okay, here's just an experiment where effectively what it was done, we injected random polarization qubits at the input of a memory here. And then you basically do a little bit like what they do in quantum cryptography. The memory doesn't know what randomized qubit is coming. And then at the end of your, say, 1 million experiments, then you do statistics, and then you compare the polarization input that the memory didn't know on a shot-by-shot basis to what it was measured out. And then what you can see is that these memories are capable of storing the state. When it was sent H, they store H, nothing came in the B part. When they need to store B, nothing came in the H, and also the superposition, right? So then entanglement, right, can always be thought as a superposition of superpositions because it's all polarizations at the same time. So what these measurements mean, the fact that all polarizations are preserved, and because the input is random, it means that these memories can actually store entanglement, right? So this is an indirect demonstration that if you were to probe them with entanglement, they will work, all right? So then the last experiment that we performed already almost like a couple of years ago is this experiment where we want to demonstrate that if you grab these qubits in two independent memories, right? They are all independent, they are getting in there, and then what you want to do is take the output of those memories and then interfere them in a form related to this Hongo-Mandel experiment, right? And what you want to demonstrate is that the photons, I mean, if they have the same polarization state, that then you can interfere them with high fidelity, right? Meaning that, well, you demonstrated that they can store entanglement, and now you want to demonstrate that they're also useful to do memory-assisted entanglement swap. Okay? So this is what is done in the next slide. You already see the measurements. Here you see the actual storage of light experiments in two independent memories, right? Memory called Alice. You see here the storage time and the retrieval of the photon. Here the same thing, storage time, retrieval of the photon. And then what you can do, right, is by modifying the storage time in each memory, you can, which is the concept of buffering, right? Exactly as we described. Then you can make them come at the same time, even though they did not arrive at the same time in the memories, right? So they can come, then match. That's what you see here. And then you can measure a Hongo-Mandel interference experiment, right? So let's say in these memories, our record right now is a visibility of 42%, probe it with coherent states. That is equivalent of something like 90% fidelity if you were to drive in with actual photons, right? So we believe that now these memories are kind of ready to start doing experiments with entanglement and entanglement swapping, all right? So now, the last thing in the puzzle here, right, is of course, as I told you before, what you're targeting now, because now you have the memories, right? By the way, we actually have a couple of patents of those memories, right? So then that's pretty cool. Now you need to have the sources that match those photons, right? And then the way we go about here we go a little bit into like quantum optics, right? Like the experiment that was performed in your grad student laboratory, right? So we have a nonlinear crystal, right? And then there are two things that we want to do. Remember what we say, right? We want to select the frequency of these photons that are produced in a way that then we can do experiments with quantum memories with them, right? This is the first one. And the second one is we want to make the generation of photon entangled pairs as high as possible with the rates, right? And the way we do about this is basically we place the crystal into an optical cavity, right? You see here is a four-mirror optical cavity, a so-called bow tie cavity, right? And then by doing that, what we gain two things, right? We gain the fact of now we can tune, by selecting the cavity length, we can tune the frequency of the photons that are coming out of the memory. So if you can stabilize this frequency to be on resonance with the atomic transitions, it means that then the entangled pairs that are coming out of that come at the atomic transition, right? And if this cavity has enough finesse, the language of the cavity will be only a few megahertz, right? Just to give you an idea, in normal entangled experiments with nonlinear crystals, the bandwidth is in the order of a few terahertz, lots. Here we want to produce pairs of photons that have a bandwidth of 1 or 2 megahertz. So then they can interact with the atomic transitions that are given by the Einstein coefficients and are always in the few megahertz, right? So that's the kind of what you're getting here. And then the other beauty of this, and this is why these systems are called optical parametrical amplifiers, you can see the process in which if this photon was chosen at the right frequency, because they are bouncing around here several times, you can see it as pseudo-amplification process in which then more and more photons will be produced here, right? So the theoretical result is that you can enhance the generation of pairs with respect to the case with no cavity by the finesse square. So for example, if you have a finesse of 1,000, you then 1 million pairs more than what we normally get without cavities, right? And that's what people think that we can get to megahertz and perhaps eventually gigahertz generation of entangled photon pairs, right? And then here in the experiment that is shown here is basically, if you do everything correctly, right? When you have resonances in the cavity, and then you put detectors where you measure coincidences for two detections, you see that when you have cavity resonances, the number of coincidences also peaks, right? Meaning that if you were to maintain the cavity lock at certain transition here, you will have always pairs at a very high rate, right? And then this video here shows that by scanning the cavity and putting it in the right mode, you can filter all kinds of modes and have them very nicely into the E00 mode resonant in the cavity that then allows you to put them into fibers with very, very high efficiency, higher than 90%. Right? That's the key here. You also clean the mode so you can put them in the fiber and not have that many losses. All right? So this is something that my student Sonali Guerra has been doing for already several years. This is actually kind of like a hard experiment. But then you see here in some of these measurements that now we can effectively produce pairs. And then by measuring the correlation functions, we do see the line width of those pairs to be what you were hoping, about 2 megahertz or so, right? And right now in the systems that we have, we can generate something like 10,000 pairs per second with a line width of 2 megahertz, right? And that's already enough to try to do this storage of entanglement that we were discussing, right? So the last thing here, right? We are now working in making these systems not only high rate of pair production, we also want to make them entangled in the polarization space, so they are compatible with the polarization quantum memories that we have. And this is done basically by having two crystals inside the cavity. This is a new prototype that we just built like a year ago. You see there are two crystals now, and as we were saying in the previous slide, right? The crystals are now 90 degrees oriented with respect to each other. So then as the blue photons get into the crystal, you either generate a horizontal pair of photons or a vertical pair of photons, right? And then because now they are inside the cavity, they sort of self-compensate for the different birefringence, right? Because they see the two different crystals. So then you see here that by changing the input polarization of the pump photon, we can create horizontally polarized pairs or vertically polarized pairs. But right here in the middle, we can actually create an entangled state, right? So then this is all very new. Actually, we just finished doing this. And now the goal, of course, and this is going to be, remember, PhD lifetime. This is going to be another PhD lifetime. Now we're setting up an experiment where we actually finally have two of these entangled pairs, right? They are being produced in there. And now we have 4 of these quantum memories that I showed you. And in the next couple of years, we're going to go for this big prize of trying to do double the storage of these entangled pairs and then do the memory-assisted entanglement as well. I guess if we do that, then I will retire. And then I will go and live in Mexico back in the So that will be awesome. All right. So then in the last 10 minutes of the conversation, let me just give you a flavor of the other thing that we're building. Right, so remember, these are all the technology that is required to build these networks. And now what we're doing in cooperation with Brookhaven National Lab is we want to bring this technology into the telecom. And we also want to develop the mechanisms and the tools to do these entanglement distribution processes on demand, right? So this is kind of like the new big thing, and then try to effectively develop that. All right, this is very briefly here, right? This is a very networky slide, so you can see what we're thinking, right? So normally when you have a Zoom call, right? The Zoom server is in this domain controller, right? And then you have these node controllers, which in this case will be your laptops, right? So then the node controller will talk to some software interface, which is called a north-bound interface, to the domain controller and says, hey, I want to start a Zoom link. And then your friend is going to do the same thing to the domain controller. By the way, these domain controllers are in China. If you didn't know, Zoom has all the domain controllers in China. So all your Zoom calls go there, okay? And then once you have that, right? What we're proposing here is instead of controlling a video and audio call, we want these node controllers to control all the electronic systems. Remember these days, your oscilloscope, your signal generators, everything that you have, they actually have an Ethernet port that then you can connect to the net, right? So you can actually form a local area network, classical, that actually, by having this stack approach, can actually control quantum optical subsystems, such as quantum memories and entangled sources, and all other kinds of quantum devices like the one that I showed. So then what you want to build is you want to build a very large local area network in which all your devices are connected classically, and you want to use the actual internet, the TCP/IP protocol, to control everything that is happening at the quantum level, right? This will be a concept of what now people are calling quantum-enabled internet, which means that the internet is still the internet, but now it has, in the hardware layer, a bunch of quantum systems that then we can play with. All right, this is kind of like a new concept in English. All right, and then we have done already some really a lot of development into setting up a real network that uses commercial fiber that is now connecting the Stony Brook campus that you see here in this Google Map picture with the BNL campus. We have it connected using 4 fiber strands. Each of these fibers is about 70 kilometers. And then we use them to move, say, entangled photons or qubits, and to use all these classical data that allows this communication using the classical data, right? So we can communicate. So this was built in the last 2 years. And then recently we've been doing experiments meant to then create entanglement between systems that are distantly located. Now, the one important thing that is here, right, is if you want to move quantum over commercial fiber, there are 2 things that you need to do, right? So remember, we always talk about these coincidences, right? Entanglement moves, and then it moves over fibers, and then you need to know which photon is entangled with which. So you need to be able to track in time how these photons are traveling, and you need to have a time resolution sharing the network that is less than the actual temporal duration of the photon itself. To give you numbers, if you use an SPDC source, that is going to give you a 50 nanosecond long pulse. So it means that you need to have a shared clock that allows you to do coincidence measurements over a long distance network that is less than 50 nanoseconds, right? That, by the way, does not exist yet. You actually have to create it, because the internet, if it has a 1 millisecond delay, it doesn't matter, because you still see your eyes are not sensitive to 1 millisecond. However, entanglement is, right? So you need to develop that, okay? So that's important. And in order to do that, right, the other thing that is also very important is, as you're moving polarization, superpositions, right, or entanglement, you need a means to guarantee, when you learn that in your systems, right, that the Poincare sphere orientations are the same in all the nodes in this long distance network, right? So then the way you create polarization entanglement is the same way that you store it, retrieve it, and analyze it. So you need a means to share the location of the Poincare sphere, so then they are not like oriented in different angles. So you need a means to preserve the polarization before you can do experiments. All right, so here is something, I mean, just very briefly, right? Now we have communication systems that allow us to have synchronized clocks, right? That allows to have a jitter over 140 kilometers in fiber of less than 2 nanoseconds, right? This is measured in this network connecting Stony Brook and BNL. So we have developed that in the last 2 years. And we have also developed polarization compensation systems, right? In which what you do is you send a laser that has more or less the same frequency as the photons that you want to propagate. And then by doing polarization measurements at the end, you have compensation systems such as the one shown here, right? That then allow you then to move the Poincare spheres and align them to the original Poincare sphere where you define your polarization axis. And then by doing that, you can adjust them to be one of the polarizations, and in this way then achieve indistinguishability in the polarization basis, so then you can do Hongo-Mandel interference, right? This is It's a little bit painful, right? And you need to be able to guarantee this because the current internet doesn't care about polarization. 20 years ago, it was determined that polarization was not a degree of freedom in the internet that we use these days. And therefore, that's something that also needs to be created. All right. So then just very, very quickly, right? We'll be doing some recent experiments in which we use the same quantum memory platform that we use to store those entangled photons to do the frequency conversion between the infrared lines where rubidium normally operates and telecom lines. The beauty of this is that rubidium actually has telecom lines. So the only thing that you need to do, as you see in this here, right? You need to use the right pumps and get to the right state, and then there is actually telecom lines. So then we're using a process that is called four-way mixing, meaning that at the same time in the memory, you put your input photons at 795 nanometers, which is the D1 line of rubidium. And then if you put that exactly at the same time with two strong pumps, one at 780 nanometers and one at 1367 nanometers, as is shown in this experiment, you actually create 1324 nanometers that are very close to the original telecom communication band at 13.2 nanometers. Here in this plot, you see that we can now do these conversion processes with efficiencies close to 10%, which is what we've been doing recently, right? And then now we use all this internet to control everything that is needed to have two of these systems operational, which is what you see here, right? So you have two of these quantum memory systems, and you would now use this local area network to control all the electronics generating all these pulses. You actually see it there, generation of qubits at 795, pumps at 780 and 1367, and then the output of the memory is those beautiful pulses at 1324 nanometers that then you can put in a fiber, and then they go all the way to BNL, right? So this is how the picture looks on the Stony Brook side, and then the idea is to perform a long-distance Hongo-Mandel experiment with the photons that are coming from these memories. Of course, what you need to do is to attenuate the input at the single photon level, so then these guys are also at the same. Okay, you put them in the fibers, and then you want to do the measurement. Okay, so then this is how the detection system looks on the BNL side. Basically, just an interference experiment. Very important. You need to share the clock, so then you know when the photons are coming, so then they can arrive simultaneously into the beam splitter. For that, you need the time sharing, the clock sharing, and you need the polarization compensation to achieve the degree of indistinguishability that you need. Okay? And then this is how the experiment actually looks like. You have the two quantum memory systems that are producing 1324 nanometer photons. Then we put them into these Hongo-Mandel interference experiments. Notice that on one hand, we had to put an additional fiber loop here because we need to remove the coherence that is shared by having the same pumps pumping the two memories. So then they become independent, like if they were individual single photons. Here you see a picture of the photons as they are detected in these superconducting nanowire detectors on the BNL side. And then I think this is the last result. These are actually measurements of a Hongo-Mandel interference over 158 kilometers of fiber, right? And then the most important thing is, remember, if you click, because it went to this Hongo-Mandel interference with high visibility, you lose the which path information as to like from which quantum memory it was generated in, therefore entangling the quantum memories over 158 kilometers in what is called an execution of the Cabrillo entanglement scheme, first proposed in 1990. Right? And then you see it for both cases when you're driving at CW and when you're driving on the pulse regime. Now you can see these features here. Notice that in the Hongo-Mandel, you actually have a bit note because this is atomic physics, right? Because you have different degrees of pump power in the two memories, you actually have different AC star shifts in the atomic systems that then give you a bit node between the two systems, which is even nicer because it means that the coherence is actually present, right? So this is where we are with these experiments. I think, there's been a lot of development here, and, in the next years, right, we want to amplify this network. So what I showed you basically was, this is Long Island, right? This is New York. Manhattan is just right here. Rochester will be somewhere around there. This is the Hudson, right? So somewhere around, right? So all the results I show you are the communication between the Stony Brook Physics campus and the BNL campus here. So recently this year, we have set new fiber connections that now connect to these co-location facilities on Long Island. This one has a very nice name, Mindshift, and this Westbury Connect. So these fibers are already available. And then now we're going to start doing experiments where we're going to convert the frequency of the entangled sources to see if we can distribute them, right? And then in the long run, we also want to have this red one that basically close the loop. This is what is called a star configuration. So then you can pick among these nodes the two that you want to be entangled. And then by knowing the IP address of this, and you can then make the whole machine work, so then they can be entangled on demand, right? So we want to make this, it has a very nice name. It's called LiquidNet, the Long Island Quantum Information Distribution Network. Catchy name, one of my colleagues made it. And it's a collaboration between Stony Brook, Brookhaven, and also the Air Force Research Lab. All right. And then just to finish, I don't do this, right? I just get to give the talks and, travel and whatnot, which is a nice perk of being a professor. But I have a group of 14 grad students right now that do all the work between the Stony Brook laboratory. For some reason, they all look very smiley here, which is not normally the case, but they all look very happy. So I'm hoping they are really. And then we also have a very nice team of senior scientists and grad students working on the Brookhaven site. And then, it is through the work of all these great people that then we can do all these things, right? So my invitation is, if you have some break, we're not that far. Come and visit us and we can show you all the toys. And then you can come and play with us a little bit, all right? So thank you very much for your attention. And I'm very happy to answer your questions.
All right, I think very nice talk, enjoyed very much. So let me open the floor for questions from here, and then we'll take questions over June. Anyone has any questions to ask?
Okay. So, well, I guess thanks for the talk, first of all. I think that was the best talk I've seen that broken down all the elements you need for the quantum network and what advances can be made.
We're legit.
The question I had was regarding the optical parametric amplifier you showed. And you said that if you see the amplification process, you can increase the effective brightness of your entangled photon source, right? So that's like the high gain regime, right, for parametric down conversion.
You're definitely way below the threshold.
Yeah.
So you are really pumping this in the low power regime.
Okay.
So then you don't create 4 photons, 6 photons, and so forth.
Okay.
Which will happen if you go into the threshold, and then you start creating a squeeze light, which then you have all those components. So the blue that you send has to be very low. In the experiment that I show you, the blue is at the level of only a few milliwatts of power.
Okay. And then I guess just a quick follow-up is, do you think that'll be enough to get to the rates you need to get high capacity data transfer?
I mean, let's say, I guess in science, you got to go step by step. Okay. Right now, we're gearing to get enough rates to demonstrate that memory-assisted entanglement swapping is possible. Me personally, I believe the route to get even higher rates is to embed those crystals into really high finesse optical cavities. I had a discussion this morning, how can you achieve small volumes with waveguide systems and so forth? So people are looking into this. So that's a possibility to get into gigahertz rates, right? Another possibility, which is also very fancy, I have some collaborations with European colleagues where we're trying to develop tunable quantum dot sources that intrinsically operate at gigahertz rates, in which then you use all kinds of tools to then tune them to be on resonance with atomic transitions. We have a paper coming out on this soon. So that's the other route. These are the two routes that I think are technically what is possible to get higher rates. I don't promise you to get to gigahertz rates anytime soon, but certainly within 5 years, I think we can demonstrate a tabletop quantum repeater experiment. Yes?
When you explained the quantum teleportation mechanism, I didn't quite understand that. So could you explain the quantum teleportation?
Yes.
Okay.
All right, so we're gonna go to like the first slide. Sorry for the people in Zoom if I'm making this. So then, this is important, right? So teleportation, right? You need two inputs. Input number one is going to be the Bell state, right? So then this Bell state can be done with one of these systems, like the one that I showed you, where you have the cavity and the two photons, right? And then you can have either the HHBB, which is the one that I showed you, or you can have the one where they are combined. Okay? Now, this is the key part here, right? You have a third photon, right? Which is going to be preparing this superposition. And remember, the alphas and the betas are the information that you're sending, right? So alpha and beta are classical coefficients. They are complex numbers, right? So then you can think that you are actually teleporting 2 bits of classical information, right? Because you have alpha and beta. So then what you do, right? You got to write mathematically a 3-photon state that you see here, right? You see you have an entangled state tensor with your qubit, right? Which is basically this guy here. The beauty of this is because the Bell states are an orthonormal basis of many photon states, you can actually write it in this form. So you see it has an entangled state and a form of the qubit, right? With phases just changing, and it's a superposition, right? So if you are able, in an experiment like this where you interfere the qubit with the Bell state measurement, notice that here you change the indexes, right? This is 3, this is 3, 4, and then now you're switching them. So you are describing them in terms of an entangled state that was not created. You are actually trying to measure it, right? So if you now interfere, for example, it says there are 4 and 1, right? What you want is that then by knowing the outcome of this measurement, so for example, what that means is say, hey, I was able to project into this Bell state, therefore I know that the remaining photon must be in this one because I eliminate all the possibilities and that photon can only be in this because I originally describing it as superposition, right? So then this is where the power of all these things is. Entanglement swapping is very similar. The fact that you can write a multi-photon state as a superposition of either the qubits multiplying the Bell states or 2 Bell states as you do it for entanglement swapping. Right, so that's the inherent, it's beautiful. This is why we all love quantum mechanics, right? Because all these tricks come out of there. Yes.
So if I understand it correctly, most of what you're building here is based on point-to-point communications. I know that if you go back about 2 generations, maybe more, depending on how you're counting, that when people were sort of debating about classical versus semi-classical versus quantum information systems, there was a lot of worry about the fact that it was really difficult, say in a circuit situation. Circuits, you need an output that can fan out to more than one input. And this was seen as a big problem.
Yeah.
Is there a solution to that within this?
Yes. All right. So I prepared some slides just to answer your question. So because I think that's a great question. So what you're thinking there is basically, if I understand what you're saying, you want to create a form of a quantum router, right? In which, say, for example, if you have some inputs here, then it can then route entanglement to different outputs. And those outputs might not necessarily be entangled at the beginning, but you want them to be entangled, right? So then in order to do that, what you need to do is to create a system. And I recall that some people here in this institute, they have done research on these photon gates, right? So basically you need a nonlinear system that allows you then to strongly route the photons one way and perhaps creating entanglement between in the process because it's a strong nonlinearity. So then this process of going beyond point-to-point communication and making it more topologically more, like you say, like a circuit, they go by having these quantum routers in between. That is a technology that currently doesn't exist. But say, for example, in my lab, I have an experiment where we're trying to do this. And let me just show you this. This is like here real quick. Yes. So you see here, we're trying to create a router, right? So this is a system that has one input and three outputs. And then, so you see here. So for example, here is a magneto-optical trap, right? And the magneto-optical trap has optical cavities surrounding it. So then what you can do here is basically come with a photon that is coming here, and then through an optical nonlinearity, route the photon either to this cavity output or to this cavity output, or to two of them simultaneously, right? So then the idea is that if eventually we could build a system like this, that instead of having two systems, they have more systems, you will have a form of a router where then you can address this question of building circuits of more complex topology, right? But that's in the future still, right? These are still under development.
All right, so I think we are running out of time, but is there any question from the Zoom, people on the Zoom? If anybody wants to ask anything, please, now is the time. I don't question. Oh, you have
Can
one? Yeah.
Okay.
So I was wondering whether it's possible to use the same quantum memory as a photon pair source using Fourier mixing and try to save the generated pairs within the same quantum memory.
It's a great question. As a matter of fact, there is a couple of papers that were published in PRL about a year ago where people are doing this. Let me just go to this slide. That's a great question. Yes. Let's share it. Right? So what you can do, because this actually looks like a parametric process, right? You can use the two pumps and not put any input, so do not drive four-way mixing, and then you will end up with two photons, right? And then what it was demonstrated is that you can make that entangled in polarization. So that works, right? The only issue is because you are sharing several lines in the excited state, those photons can come with a really large bandwidth, right? So then you will have to filter with some frequency filter or so if you would like to achieve the same super narrow bandwidth that we have with the other sources. So if you don't care much, it's fine. But if you do care, you have to do that. And then that then decreases the rates. And then they become they compare not so favorable to the other one where the rates scale with the finesse of the cavity. But certainly you can do it. And it's great because then by its nature, its concept and its design, the photons are resonant with the atoms already, right? Yes. Yes. It's just like a matter of the rates that you can achieve and whether or not you can then demonstrate that, right? But I know of 3 groups that are actually pursuing that route, so yes.
And a follow-up question is whether it's possible to enter the photon blockade regime in such systems because we are seeing multiple energy levels. Would it be possible to have a splitting between the energy levels to achieve photon blockade? So
photon blockade will be great. I think in order to achieve photon blockade in a system like this, you need a system where you have a cavity. So you can have sort of like a Purcell enhancement that then will drive this photon blockade. So yes, it's possible to do it like that, but you will have to, in one of these systems, or maybe 2 of the systems, have actually cavity modes that allow to have like a super big light matter coupling, and then you can probably do it, right? I actually have a paper from many, many years ago where we talk about this concept of multi-cavity electromagnetically induced transparency, where we theoretically show that what you're thinking is actually possible. It's just we have not yet built systems where many cavities are coupled to the same set of atoms, which is what we're trying to do, but that's actually a great question. Yes. Great idea.
All right, well, let's thank Eden once again.